retired naval architect, now consultant architect.
To the second in our series of lectures for 1993. Tonight we have a very, very special lecture, which centers around a special boat, the Buzzards Bay 25, Aria. I see many familiar faces in the crowd tonight that have been touched in some way by this boat, either through ownership of her or a sister ship, or have just admired the beauty of this design. As a 12-and-a-half owner myself, I have done a lot of research and investigation into the origins of the design and have really come to admire the Buzzards Bay 25. It really represents the epitome of, the genius of Captain Nat Herreshoff. And we have a great group of speakers tonight, the first of which is Paul Bates, who was very generous in his donation of Aria to the museum. Paul recognized that at the museum, Aria would receive much admiration and attention, and since she represents the highlight of Captain Nat's work, this is really a great place for her to be. And Paul will talk to you tonight about the history of the class and of Aria, and then later on we'll have details of the design, and we will hear from many of Aria's former owners, and so we have a great night planned. So to start off, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Paul Bates from Noank, Connecticut, the donor of Aria.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. Mike asked me to put together a little brief history of the class. I thought first I ought to try and pass the buck to Maynard Bray, but I didn't have any luck. But he suggested we talk with David Cheever, who lives in Dedham, Massachusetts. So we made an appointment to go up and visit David. He's 86 years old, runs around, spry as a cat, and as sharp as a tack. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it this evening, for he's off to the Baltic for a honeymoon cruise with his new wife. He put together a few of his thoughts, and I thought they were certainly better than I could put together on the class, and I asked him if I could read them, and that's what I have for you this evening. This brief account of an outstanding effort which never fully flowered is peppered with ifs and might have beens. It is offered as a matter of historical record. Herreshoff was already the outstanding designer-builder name to conjure with when the story starts in 1914. The Beverly Yacht Club started north of Boston, close by Marblehead, in 1872, featuring small boat racing. The move to Buzzards Bay was clearly motivated by the fine sou'westers most summer afternoons produced. The calms and fickle breezes in Massachusetts Bay could not compare with the robust breezes south of the Cape. By 1914, when this story begins, the Beverly Yacht Club had been through various phases which included catboats, knockabouts, and sloops. Before waking up to the fact that the greatest good for the greatest number could be achieved by several one-design classes, which thus avoided the financial pitfalls of over-designing and overbuilding. After all, it was a rare boat that had a first-class racing record after more than 4 or 5 years of stiff competition in an open class. The famous Herreshoff 15-footers started the ball rolling in 1899 with credits to Herreshoff genius, plus helpful arranging from Emmons, Parkinson, and Stackpole. Tradition always had it that the 15-footer had little of Columbia in her lines, and the same applied to the 18-footers. Both classes were characterized by long ends, which gave them speed and bearing when heeled over and a thrash to windward. To be truthful, this characteristic was not an unmixed blessing, because both classes took a punishing beating in the stiff chop involved in a stiff sou'wester. Crews were limited to 3 in these 2 classes. By 1914, it became evident that long-ended small yachts must have changes made because of drooping ends or hogging and a tendency to leak when unduly punished. Captain Nat had the answer in his plan. It involved short ends, more freeboard, plus moderate draft for Buzzards Bay conditions. Robert Emmons had been looking for the ideal adolescent adapted small racing boat. The result was a tremendously successful 12-footers, which stand as a class alone after 79 years. Its success was a sou'west chop and the genius that was Herreshoff. The stage was set for an enlarged one design class which would fill the needs of mature crews. 25 Herreshoff Special. The resulting class measured 25 feet overall, 25 feet on the waterline, 8 foot 9 inches beam, and a draft of 3 foot without the centerboard. Outside fixed ballast 3,000 pounds, sail area not over 550 square feet. It is worth taking a look for a moment at the 18-footer previously referred to. They look for all the world like an enlarged 15-footer, but were 29 feet overall, 8 foot 1 inch beam with a 3 foot draft, with a 2,000 pound ballast, 470 square feet of sail. It will be quickly noted that the 25-footer with sweep forward lines coupled the short favored overhang made for a much more sea-kindly line than the long overhang of former one designs. Herreshoff Special Class 25-foot numbered 5 boats in 1915. D0, Bethesda, Gladstone, D1, Whitecap, Amory, D2, Mink, Stockton, D3, Bagatelle, Delancey, D4, Tarantula, Langshaw. These boats raced for 4 seasons. Season champions were 1914 Mink, 1915 Bagatelle, 1916 Mink, 1917 through 1920 no racing because of the war, and 1920 Mink. The 1914 season was The 1914 season was distinguished by a unique incident which points up the ifs and might have been referred to at the beginning of this account. The date in question was August 1st, 1914, and the fact was related to me by fine old Robert Stone, who came to be a close friend in Dedham in the 1970s. On the day in question, the judges for the race were G.P. Robinson and Howard Stockton Jr. The report reads, wind wholesale southwest, changing to a very heavy northwest squall, then wholesale southwest. There were 4 classes racing in different directions in the upper reaches of the bay. In the 25-foot Herreshoff Special Class were Mink, Bagatelle, Bethesda, and Whitecap. These 4 were closely bunched and were having their hands full when they were carrying wholesale in a reef breeze. There were 3 in Bethesda's crew. 2 of the 3 men were members of the Stone family, and the 3rd was a professional boatman who worked for the family. Bob Stone was about 14 at the time and was not very experienced, so was left ashore because 3 strong men were needed. With no warning, the lowering sky became black. The wind shifted almost 180 degrees, and all hell broke loose. Strangely enough, the 25s found themselves in the middle of a twister. The rain came in blinding sheets, and sails were doused on the run. There was no time to secure the crotch. The boom came crashing down over the cuddy, and the gaff followed it. The crewmen, knowing that there was no time to pass stops, jumped up on the gaff and boom, with mainsail between, and lying on his stomach, wrapped his arms and legs around the mainsail trying to hold it down. Bob Stone was told that, owing to the twisting action, the two spars were blown upward on the mast, leaving the struggling man in a perilous position. The whole episode took less time than it takes to write about it. The rest of the crew got the spars on deck again. The crewman was unhurt. The Bethesda was half full of water, and it took some time to clear her, for the 25s were not made of self-bailing cockpits. This was in the interest of keeping the crew weight down low, and on the assumption that the new design was so stiff that the vessel wouldn't ship water, and it wasn't assumed that she would be caught in a miniature hurricane. Right here, it should be noted that the twister was narrow and localized. The other classes were shaken up, but unharmed, and only one other boat withdrew. This mishap could not have come at a worse time for the fledgling 25s. The middle of the first season of a new design, with everyone watching from the porch of the brand new clubhouse. It involved people who were skilled, substantial members, and whose judgment was looked up to. Herreshoff never built another boat for this particular class, and the pendulum started to swing to self-bailing cockpits. Not completely, though, because the notable S-class, which appeared in 1913, was a deep cockpit design, and one which was given great satisfaction in spite of the curved mast, which made reefing a complicated safety measure. The old 25s were going their unheralded way, and even today, 4 of the 5 are in existence and in good hands. The only missing boat is Tarantula, which disappeared from the Beverly book in the 20s. Many of us would like to find her, and hopefully in original condition. If it weren't for the ifs and might have beens, the class would be appealing today. Day sailing is becoming more and more popular again, with short cruises, while short cruises are a complicated procedure. David Cheever, April 19, 1993. I had a few more thoughts about the evolution of the class, and I'd like to include some of Captain Knapp's personal boats for your thoughts. 1908, Delight, which was 28.5 feet. 1911, after a trip to Bermuda with intentions of returning, and quite possibly seeing content by then, a Bermuda-built boat, very similar to the 12.5. Designed and had built Oleander, number 710, 23.5 foot, which he took to Bermuda, but found her unseaworthy for the Bermuda winters. 1912, Valerian 3, number 718, 26 foot. In the fall of 1913, with a little work on the model, a Newport 29. In 1914, with a little more work on the model, Sadie, which fortunately is right behind us in the next room. And then later in 1914, he cut a new model, which became the Herreshoff Special. Halsey?
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and I'd just like to say, first of all, that nothing nicer has happened to the Herreshoff Marine Museum in its 22 years than the donation of the Aria, and just to walk in the morning and see that bow poking out of the room there makes my day, every day, and I'm going to do that about every day that I come in. I'm going to look right in that room and see that bow of the Aria. So we're very, very pleased that she's here, and thankful to you, and we're also extremely thankful to the 2 gentlemen who did the restoration job. and I'm going to introduce them in just a minute. But before that, I'd just like to also remark a little bit about the Buzzards Bay 25 class that I remember many years ago when Jim Hardy came to Bristol and visited my father at the model room where Captain Nat's models are. Jim Hardy, of course, was the skipper of many Australian challenges. I sort of wish he'd kept at it, but he didn't anyway. But he came many times, and he asked my father that day, what was your father's favorite model in this model room? And without any hesitation at all, Sidney Herreshoff said, oh, it's this one right here. And he pointed to the Buzzards Bay 25. And my father told me that a number of times since, and I think told my nephew also the same thing, that of all the models he made, he himself felt that this was the one that he considered to be his favorite. And I think as we look at that, we might think the same thing. When we began to talk to Paul about the area and the idea of it coming up here, he made it very clear that he really wanted this to happen in combination with the boat being restored. And he didn't have any hesitation about saying who should do it, then Phil Brick and Andy Giblin. And it's been a very wonderful project that they've done with utter dedication and responsibility to do everything the way it was before. And while she had been kept in good sailing form, there had been some modifications over the years. And I think they'll explain to you about those modifications and about how they brought the shape of the deck house and all of that back to just what it was originally. And I'm sure that this boat looks today very close to the way she did when she left the shop, and probably looks better than she ever has, with the possible exception of the day she left the shop. Who knows, maybe she looks better today. But it's all as a result of the great skill of these two gentlemen, and I'd like to turn the program over to them to tell you something about their philosophy in working on these great boats like the Aria, and hopefully some detail on what they did. So with that, I'd like to introduce Andy Giblin and Ben Philbrick. Please come forward.
I want to say thank you for coming, and both Ben and I know we're really excited to be here, to finally put this project to bed. So it's not often that we have a captive audience, so we're going to take advantage of it and to inflict you with some of our philosophies, so you're held captive. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then Ben's going to take you through the slides. Some of the things we're going to talk about are things that our other partner, who's not here tonight, Ed McClade, has mentioned in previous lectures. So I think those ideas are important enough that we should re-emphasize. It appears to us that this is in case I really get bored, that slide comes up. Boring, there we go. It appears to us that there's indiscriminate use of the word restoration when applied to work on these old wooden boats. Too often it's used to describe an activity that ranges from a simple revarnishing to complete rebuilding. And what we like to say we do at our shop, Ben's house, is we rebuild boats. We don't usually say we restore them. When a boat leaves our shop, whether it be a 12 and a half, 15, a fish, or a New York 50, which can't actually leave the shop because it's too big. These boats have very little original structure left, and often they incorporate slight technical structural changes that we hope will extend the useful life of the boat. We make these changes after carefully examining the weaknesses that 60 to 80 years of on-the-water destructive testing have brought to light. Here we have an advantage that Captain Nat never had. We got to see what didn't work and what did work. However, the modifications that we employed are almost always, without exception, strengthening techniques that Captain Nat used on larger boats where the stresses and strains in the boats were proportionally much greater than on the little boats. And some of the examples are, you may be familiar with some of these technicalities, are tapered frame heels rather than square frame heels. So we have a little more meat down low where the strength is needed. but yet we still save the weight up high. Diagonal deck strapping, even in the little boats, we put that in to help stiffen the deck for some panel strength. Often we'll use things called hanger bolts, which are extra heel bolts that thread into the lead to help distribute some of the load. This is also used on bigger boats. And the other thing we do often is we kerf the frames back aft. A lot of people are familiar with the broken frames back in the hard turn of the boat. By kerfing it, that is splitting it for the length in the turn, we hope that we relieve the built-in stress and it won't break even a few years down the road. Now, the other thing that we do quite a bit of, and some of the people who work with us can attest, is we do a lot of painting. We even pre-paint the frame before we bend them into the boat so that every surface is sealed. We do a lot of sealing as well. That is closing up so the water can't get to the water. We slow down the moisture change. This is something that really wasn't cost effective here on a production line standpoint because they had to build boats for a price and they were in the profit. We do it. We have to build them for a price too, although there's no profit. So we hope that with these slight modifications that really are historically keeping, that we can, and the attention to preventative maintenance, that we can maybe have these boats have a useful life even longer than the first. So what I want to do is tie that plug in for our shop with the Aria project. And the Aria project really represents our first true attempt at a restoration. Because of historical importance, we tried to save as much of the original structure as possible, even if it meant saving a weakened component and working in a less efficient manner than would have been by simply replacing the entire component. We did this for historical accuracy again, and because we knew, and this is not a popular idea, we knew the boat was not supposed to be sailed. If the idea had been to sail the boat, it would have been much more work, and we would have had at the cost of losing much of the original structure. And just an aside, Aria, with the exception of the work that we did, which Ben will show you, is extremely original in her hull. And that was one of the factors that made the boat so important. And granted, it's not a popular idea not to sail the boat, and as much as we enjoy seeing these rebuilt boats here in the Rendezvous or the Classic Art Regatta, it's important to save some of that original Herreshoff construction. When someone like myself or Ben or Ed we want to come to a museum and see Herreshoff construction, not a Clay, Filbert, and Gibbons' interpretation or Narragansett shipwrights or Steve Ballantyne or George Zachmore. We want to see actual Herreshoff construction because, as I mentioned before, it's important to see what worked and what didn't, where the weaknesses were. And if we go around and fix all these boats up, make them all nice and new, we're not going to know. And what we want to be able to do is to copy the good things that work and fix the things that didn't work. And as an aside, this is a personal note, so I won't hold anyone responsible. It's very reassuring when you come and you examine these boats very carefully, or you take one apart. Every now and then, you find a shim, or maybe you find a hole that was drilled through the side of the fore timber, or maybe you find a rivet that got bent over instead of peened. And you kind of have to smile because as magnificent as these boats are, and it's very important to remember they were built by human beings. And I think with that, I'm going to have Ben come up and take you through the slides.
I'm Ben Philbrick, and this is the first slide of the sale plan of the Aria, which we were able to procure through the MIT Art Nautical Collection. I don't know how many of you were down here at Kurt Hasselbach's talk, but it was very informative, and he was very helpful and sent them down immediately when we asked for them. This is the construction plan. And what's so terrific about having the collection up at Hart is you can get them to scale as well as reduced scale for looking at for fun, but for us we really do need them to scale. Not so much on the Aria project, but for all the other projects where we are replacing bolts, floor timbers, dropping the lead, making a new centerboard, making a new rudder. What was so essential for this project, however, was the layout for the combings and the cuddy. When the boat arrived, she was like this with a fourth ship's front of the house extending well beyond where it was supposed to. And it also traveled back 2 frame bays further aft than originally designed. So this was my shop, our shop. And here's another view looking down on the bow. The original cleat was there. There's a fair amount of original hardware which has been saved over the years. And one of the first things we did was just quickly take some photographs of what she looked like and did some preliminary investigations of what was needed attention. And so the first thing we did was to remove the house entirely.
I should just interject that Mr. Farnham put that house on, and
Right.
the work he did was maybe not aesthetically pleasing, as he admitted, but I'll tell you, it came off with a fight. It was very well done.
It was good. The house was put on very, very well, and it came off with a struggle. And I should also say, if anybody has any questions, please speak up at any time. Please interrupt. I'll try to answer them as we go. Here we see the bulkhead moved back 2 frame bays from the original location. I think it's 2 frame bays. And the benches are quite old. 1 original post on port side. Save that. And here we're just poking around, and we knew there was some trouble in the covering board area. This is the interior of the boat. House is still on, but we're just, again, recording what the problems are and how she looked. Here the ceiling is coming away from the frames. The fastenings have let go over the years. You can see some of the rust streaks from the iron fastenings in the deck. A truss has been added to help support the mast step. Again, I'm not, would Freddie Farm do that, or?
It was a 6-meter.
The 6-meter rig had that put in? And several of the Herreshoff boats have come through with these little boxes way up forward. And some people say they're original, some say they're added, but we found numerous of them in the boats. Watchel 15 had one, didn't it? And what is so remarkable about the interior here is everything is original. The original ceiling, original frames, original deck beams, original clamp, floor timbers. Here I'm pointing out it's a cast nut which held the bolt for a large main brace that went from that corner of the clamp down towards the centerboard trunk alongside the main sill for the bulkhead. You can also see here how the nails over the years, iron nails have split open the deck beam from their rusting away and expanding. On the outside of the frame, the deck beams are look relatively healthy, but as soon as we pulled one off of there, it just completely fell apart in 2 pieces. Forward again. The house is off. Came a seesaw for the dogs. Dogs are an integral part of boat shops, it seems. We have several, and visitors frequently. There was an aft bulkhead that initially we thought was original, and we went and looked at Bagatelle, which happens to be on the Pawcatuck River, and she has an aft bulkhead. So we thought, oh, gee, we have to save this. And then we went and looked at O'Larian up at the museum at the seaport, and she does not have one. And we got the head scratching, and sure enough, we went back to the construction plan, and there's no picture of the bulkhead. So therefore, that was added as a very useful storage area space, but not original. So that was removed. I guess we're all familiar with the square-headed nuts now. Again, just showing the various conditions of things. Here we see the original frames, some butt blocks, original as well. And we removed some pieces of ceiling that were easily taken out so that we could refinish them on the bench rather than crawling up inside the boat to scrape them and sand them and paint them. So several pieces were removed for quickening the process. Picture of the mast partner showing the 8-sided mast partner itself for the original gaff rig with the mast wedges. Condition of the deck beams. Again, they don't look too bad here, but we know that that deck is full of iron. Here we see the half frames alongside the centerboard trunk with the original cast clips to support the floor timbers and going to the centerboard deadline. What's interesting is the head of that bolt is on the inside of the trunk, so that was assembled, each side assembled with the clips on and then installed with the floor timber afterwards. Here we see the original rivets on the frames, and also there's this slide I realized there. Here's what the original bulkhead was, and there's a bolt here and another cut off one right here. that went up through the main brace, which we'll see later on. And that was bolted through and through, right through the hull, into the brace itself. This was a later addition, these two rods coming down the forward end of the centerboard trunk to give it some stability and strength. One of the things that was added on over the years, which we removed, to bring it back to its original condition. Here we have the house off. We're in the process of jacking the deck back up, which had flattened out over the years. The foredeck had sagged down. So we made a beam mold, a pattern, which I'll have a picture of later on, to get the right crown of the boat, of the deck. And there's a jack on deck. We're beginning to push the deck back up to its proper position. We have another piece of wood coming across the boat to hold the beam, the stay-lack, which won't spread on us. We get change shape while we're working on it. And we stripped all the canvas off to reveal any problems we have in the covering boards or decking. We found just two little small spots in the covering board that needed attention. And we quickly sanded down and scraped the deck. And we ended up putting in beeswax in those nail heads. So if anything did, if she got more humid over the years in the shed here, which I doubt she will, if the iron decided to expand and raise up, it would meet a very soft medium with the beeswax. And hopefully not push the canvas up. That had been done years ago. I think, Paul, you've done that, I think, and it worked quite well, putting the beeswax into the nail heads. Slide showing the ceiling popping off, which we were able to refasten down with, we used some bronze ring nails, and most of it laid down nice and flat. This is showing where the aft bulkhead was, and the years of paint in the cockpit, and the lack of paint up inside the lazarette. We temporarily fastened on some cleats, you can see up on the left-hand side, that we had posts up against the side deck to get the right crown while we were fitting the new combings. Here our posts are in place. The whole interior's been scraped down now. Troy Cannon must have spent two of the most miserable days of his life up in there. Here's our beam mold. This is a pattern of plywood that we made to create the female side or pattern for the shape of the crown, best we could. Our little posts are in place to get the crown of the deck up, keep it up while we're tromping around inside and out. After scraping and beeswaxing the nail heads, we quickly painted the deck, and here you can see how the aft deck was laid out with the king plank and the nib ends coming in. It's a pine deck, square edge. And one of the things they did, we'll see later on in the slide, is these nib ends don't necessarily land on deck beams. Yes?
How did you determine the original crown?
Well, that's a good question. It's listed on the construction plan. So many inches and so many feet.
How did you keep the shape?
With those poles underneath and the posts.
Right.
And they're in the boat now.
How would you do this differently if you were going to have the boat out sailing, this deck repair?
How would we do that differently?
With a skill set.
You mean with the new deck, how would we keep the crown in the new deck?
I mean, after you got done with the chainsaw, what would you be doing with the? Yeah, what kind of surface would you use? That sort of.
Well, that would depend on the owner and what kind of, if they wanted to race it hard.
Yeah.
More than likely, we would put some bracing in, some diagonal strapping over the deck beams. And either a laid deck or the owner insisted possibly a plywood deck, but more than likely a laid deck like that. Fore and aft.
The strapping is visible from inside the cabin?
Yes, it's in between the deck and the deck beam, so you can see it when you look up. But getting back to these little nib ends, they fitted pieces of wood in between each deck beam, so in case the way they laid out those nib ends, it didn't land on a deck beam, it would be supported by these small blocks of wood, which we'll see later on. We had to refasten the deck here and there, where we needed the shape to remain stable, meaning some of the decking was floating around a little bit. We needed to have that absolutely down, so when we put the combing or trim on, we knew we had a good foundation. So we did some minor refastening in the deck. Now we're getting to the point of making the combing trap for steam bending the combing. This is our good friend William Mills, who brought over a wheelbarrow load of clamps. I think we used every one. And brought them out of retirement. They were down in the basement. They need a little lubrication. Anyway, this is a combing trap, but we've built several now for various shapes. We have one for the 12.5 fish boat, now the Watch Hill 15, and we have one for Buzzards Bay 25, if anybody needs combing tools. And this was derived from Ed McClave's overbend formulas and calculations that he worked out initially on Spartan, on New York 50 we reframed down in Westbrook, Connecticut. And we used, the main reason is so you can bend a piece of wood outside the boat to an overbent shape, so when it relaxes, it is the shape you desire, which was instrumental in bending these frames, which were 3 inches square at the heel, over 3 inches square, tapering up to 2 7/8 at the head, and 12 feet long. So we could bend them on a table, they would relax to where we would want them, and then we'd be able to bevel them and install them in the boat. So Ed has carried this further to combings, transoms, stems, and I must admit, every single time it has worked right on the money. He has revised the figures for various species of wood, so now we have it for mahogany and oak. And teak is a little bit of a struggle, but we can manage it. It's a remarkable formula, and it works every time. This is slightly, you can see the crotch effect here, the bevel, so we have a port and a starboard bend for the layout of the bevel, the combing on the deck. This slide is out of focus, it's not your eyes. This is just showing the whole setup with our tube that we're using for a steam box. And we don't need to steam the entire length of the combing since the aft end is quite straight. So we're just simply supporting it and keeping it wet outside of the box itself. We covered that end that was sticking out in the sun with burlap to keep it moist. And we had every available source of steam going into that box for this particular bend. We had a steam cleaner we adapted for use, and we'll see that in action here in a minute. So we're getting nervous, and it's time to steam them. These are 18 feet long pieces of wood that we were fortunate to find in Westerly, Rhode Island, and went through a huge pile of mahogany and finally found 2 suitable pieces. We come out of the steam box and we're clamping one end to the form, the other end is up in the air as we're wrapping it around. And all that steam is being generated by a steam cleaner on a wand or a faucet type apparatus that keeps the piece of mahogany quite hot and keeps it also from cooling off fast, which would develop surface checks, which renders the piece quite difficult to finish when you're done. It's too badly checked on the surface. So it is being wrapped around. Andy's playing the wand on the piece of mahogany to keep it hot and wet. Now the weight of the mahogany is just about wrapping itself around the form. The tough battle's over. There's one done there, one to go. So once that's on the form, we leave it 3 to 6 hours. And we monitor how much it's springing back. And this time we laid it on the floor and took some measurements for the cord of how much depth we wanted on the curve. And rigged up a quick Spanish windlass to hold it where we wanted it. The next step was to take it out to the boat and start fitting it. I should backtrack a little bit. What we've done here is we've added on, I don't know if you remember before, but the decking ended abruptly all the way across the boat. So we've added 6 new deck beams to the proper length so we'll be able to put on the new house. And we've put up these temporary forms that will hold our combing right where we want it, to the right bevel of the deck, while we fit the bottom edge and fit the apex, the front of the combing. A shot of our forms. They're just temporarily screwed down and bolted through the deck. They'll be taken up once we're fitted. So we fitted the combings, and it wasn't a very exciting picture. So we took them off. Now we've canvassed the deck, cut the opening to the exact size of the new combings. The canvas is laid in white lead. We decided to go with white lead just as it would have been in 1914. Number 10 canvas, stretched out taut, and we wetted it down and then quickly painted it. within a few hours of that. We use staples instead of tacks. We figured I'll omit that little modern convenience. I'm sure it was copper tack originally, but we used Monel staple just so we go so much quicker, and it's hidden by the tow rail. No one will know but you. Here's the new combing, all finished off in the shop, been varnished up, smoothed up, sanded. It's being installed. We're going to leave the top edge high for the time being until we're all fastened down, and we'll lay out the proper height and get ready for fitting the cutting. Which is happening now. We've put in these carlins here, these pieces of oak and steam bent and fitted and fastened to the combing, and then the top edge is beveled off for the crown of the cutty. And then these ash deck beams, which we steam bent. We think some of these were sawn out and some were steam bent. We elected to steam bend these, we thought it would be quicker. Steam bend them over form, and then we put a little straight back or two straight framework pieces underneath and held it in line for us as we fitted them. Here they are. I guess just about all done. Looking forward. See the little carlin here is left extra long. We'll cut it back to this beam once the bulkhead is in, as we're fitting the bulkhead pieces. It's interesting, on the construction plan it'll say white ash or, and it'll specify another type of wood. So there was some leeway there for the shop foreman to choose his favorite type of wood, I think. They're the half dovetails. We borrowed this half dovetail technique from an S-boat. A good friend of ours, Wes Greenleaf, was rebuilding down in Noank, and his cutty was all built the same way. So we elected to imitate it, since Sadie, we couldn't really see how she was put together, nor Larian. We didn't have x-ray vision, so we decided this was the way to go, to the best of our knowledge, how it might have been put together. Therefore, in keeping with other boats built by Herreshoff. So there's the cutty completed. We're fitting the trim pieces. We had to steam bend that aft piece going across the back. We did it right on top of the cutty, but it did not live there. It lives on the face of the cutty. And we use cedar decking for the top of the cutty, tongue and groove, and then canvas covered that. And the tow rails are going on. And we derive that shape. Again, that's sort of a puzzle to a lot of people, but we consulted with Halsey, and we decided to go with this shape so it could blend in nicely with the aft end of the bow chocks that you see up on the foredeck. The bulkhead is going in, and here you can see the bottom edges of these braces I keep talking about, which are in the drawing, and there was speculation whether they were put in the year after or the year she was built. And we're pretty convinced at this point that they were built in originally, since there was no way Andy discovered that you could put them in afterwards. Because they bird mouth, they notched around the clamp up above, and then fit tight against the centerboard trunk. There was only one way to put them in, that was before the deck went on. And it also had a bolt up against the frame head underneath the bulkhead, which was the biggest clue. So we determined they were originally installed equipment. Kind of cuts your access into the cutty, but there they are. See, we begin to work on the centerboard trunk, getting that ready for further painting and prettying up. There's a detail of the trim we decided to use on the cutty top. The drawing was not terribly clear as to the shape of that. So we went and looked at Sadie, which is hull number 732 here in this museum. The Buzzards Bay class number 733. So we go, well, one boat later, hopefully it's this trim, which is very similar to the Newport 29 trim, which is dissimilar from the smaller boats, like the Fish class, just a little half round. Alarian was a half round, so we elected to go with the larger style trim. The detail again borrowed from Sadie's tow rail configuration aft, with nibbed ends for the corner block going, meeting up with the transom tow rail piece. Meanwhile, we had a 12.5 in the shop, which we needed to get out of the shop so we could keep going with other bigger projects in the shop. So we had to move Aria out of the way briefly while 12.5 went down to Bruce Avery's yard in Noack. So there's a little bit of history going by each other. And this cleared out the bay where the 12.5 was, so Andy could get to work on the benches, which were too short since the bulkhead had been moved aft. The benches had been chopped, and now we're moving the bulkhead into its original position, so we had to extend the benches by 18 inches or so. So we scarfed on a piece so we could keep the original bench rather than jettisoning the whole bench and think, well, let's use as much as we can. Ceilings going back in. These are the pieces we had on the bench. So much easier to work on. Everything's been scraped and sanded.
Is that ceiling cedar?
It's cypress,
Cypress?
about 7/16 or so. Herreshoff used the cypress ceiling frequently. A little tougher than the cedar. And again, we had to extend the cockpit sole forward, so Andy's added 3 cross pieces underneath for the sole to lay on, and the teak pieces going on. This little fairing piece is sort of decided to take a walk away from the boat, so we had to haul that back into position. And we did some very minor refastening of the boat here and there, just to hold things together enough for painting that was about to commence. We did quite a bit of painting up outside the shop, but the weather was beginning to deteriorate, so we moved the boat, thanks to Bruce Avery, down to his yard in Noack. And we simply sanded and primed out the whole hull just to see where we were as far as fairness, and a new water line was going to be scribed to the original construction plan. So we decided, well, let's wipe that right out and we'll start from scratch. So here she is going down to Noack. And meanwhile, a fish boat was coming up the driveway the same day. This is down in Noack, where we were inside a plastic shed at Bruce's yard, and slaving away and getting things squared away to look nice again. Here we are looking back at, there's a little box of wood I mentioned earlier, holding up the nib ends of the decking. And this gives a good shot of how the transom was held together with the small cleats on either side of the main transom knee, which is through bolted. The original floor timbers. Looking forward, everything's been painted out. Trim of the cuddy's been put on. Centerboard caps on. Box removed. Decided to leave the bilge unpainted. I just think that's probably the way it was. Benches are installed at this point, some hardware. Cockpit trim is on, varnished up. Soles all cleaned up. There's one piece of teak there. We were checking off the checklist what needed to be done. That was one of the last ones to get completed. And there we pulled it out to shoot the water line. Leveled the boat up fore and aft in the foreship, set up our builder's level, went to the drawing, picked the 2 points, bow and stern, then shot the water line, quickly scribed it with a batten and a saw, rolled her back inside the shed so we could keep painting. Then she finally got the call to come up here. Off it went on the road trailer and up to the museum. Here she is.
We had a lot of help, and a lot of people were interested in the project, so we quickly like to mention a few people who helped us. You heard about Troy Cannon, who had to lay on his back in there scraping the overhead.
His feet were one of those slides.
A fellow named Chris Burnham helped us too. You heard about Wes Greenleaf helping us with the cutty top. And a very special thanks to Bill Mills, who's helping us with the steaming. We've called on Bill's many talents many times. It's the very nice turned posts that hold the benches up are a fine product of Bill. Bill's going to help us with some hardware too. Not everyone knows that. And certainly to Bruce, he was very, very generous in moving the boat and giving us the space down at his yard. Thanks to John Hall, led us aboard the sister ship Bagatelle many times for reference. To Mystic Seaport for allowing us to tromp all over Illyrian with our muddy boots. And certainly the Herreshoff Museum for the same helpful access to Sadie. And thanks to Nancy DeStang, who took many of the photos.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Here in the slides. And of course, special thanks to Paul and to Halsey, who agreed to let us do this project and had the confidence in our abilities. And we had a lot of fun doing it, and we very much like to work with them in the future.
Well, that's wonderful, and I hope we can have some of those pictures in, maybe we can get some print form and make an exhibit of this around the boat so that people can realize that it doesn't just happen by itself by any means. We'd like to now conclude this program with maybe the best part, which is a brief panel discussion by some very notable people who come who have had association with the Buzzards Bay 25s over the years. And I think, Paul, you're going to be the sort of MC of that, and we'd like to ask all the participants that are involved with that to please come forward, and we're going to have you seated here, and Paul's going to shoot some questions at you. Come ahead forward. We have Roger Taylor and James Giblin. Another Giblin here, you know, and John Hall and Mrs. Duncan Doolittle and John Hawk. You should all come and sit around. Where's Paul? Okay, Paul. Do you want to take the microphone, or you want to just do it without? Let me give you the microphone so you can be heard. You, moderator should be able to outshout the others. There you go. There you go. All right. There you go. Fine.
Thank you all very much. Now, unfortunately, there were a couple previous owners who weren't able to make it this evening of Buzzards Bay 25s, but fortunately they sent some of their thoughts. I'd like to ask Jim Giblin to read his Fred Farnham's words.
Sure. Probably have to put it down or something. Let's see, Fred Farnham bought the boat from Roger Taylor, and when was that? 59. And Fred did an awful lot of work to the boat. He did quite a bit of refastening. He got a new mainsail for it, new jib for it. Marvelous mainsail. The Smith mainsail, Paul used it up until just a few years ago. It was a magnificent sail, and I don't know of any sail that ever lasted as long and did such fine service. It got repaired a couple of times and it still hung in there. It was just a marvelous piece of work. But the boat today owes a great deal to Fred, because when I bought it from him, I think he only sailed it 2 summers. And the boat, and I'll say later, was really very sound. I did my best to twist his arm to come tonight, and he wrote this letter to Mike. Maybe it explains why I wasn't as persuasive as I might have been. Dear Mr. Pizzari, please excuse my tardy reply to your most kind and generous invitation to your lecture series in Buzzards Bay 25-footers. My wife and I had hoped to be able to attend, but her present ill health precludes a nighttime trip. We both saw the boat in No Ink a month ago, and were in awe of the fine restoration. It hardly seems possible it was over 30 years ago that I sold Aria to his father Jim. Strange things happen in this world of boats. An anecdote you might appreciate is as follows. I was working in the boat shop of Alan Vitesey in Mattapoisett in late 1959 when I fell in love with L. Francis Herreshoff's plan of Rosinante. I sent for a set of drawings and visited L. Francis at his castle in Marblehead. We discussed the boat, and he made me a set of fittings. Later that winter, I bought Aria from Roger Taylor of Good Boats fame. When I sheepishly told Al Francis of my purchase, he hid his disappointment in the most gracious of ways by saying, "Well, Mr. Farnham, you bought a boat almost as good as the one you were going to build." I'm sorry to miss your show next Tuesday, but my wife and I loved Aria and won a few races with her, and are overjoyed to find how the museum appreciates her. Fred Farnham. Fred did a great deal. So that's Fred, but he was a real key owner in this process. So.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
David Cabot owned Bagatelle with his father for quite a few number of years, and took it over after his father passed away. He did quite a bit of work on the boat, and needless to say, won more than his share of races. He also was unable to join us tonight, but Roger Taylor has a letter from David. I'd like to ask him to come on.
Dave couldn't be here. He's written a great long letter. I'll do a little bit of picking and choosing here. My involvement with the 25s actually began about 20 years before my birth, when my dad, Edward Cabot, and my uncle Nelson were in their teens racing the Talaris and other Herreshoff 15s out of Wings Neck and Buzzards Bay. By their account, the 15 sailors were a gung-ho bunch, and it was a matter of great pride among them never to shorten sail no matter what the weather. When Captain Nat was commissioned to design and build the 25s as a class for these young hotshots to graduate to, it was a natural thing for them to sail the boats in the same fashion. When they found out to their dismay in the middle of a vicious thundersquall off Marion, what they found out in the middle of the vicious thundersquall was that the 25s must be treated with a bit more discretion than the 15s, due, I guess, to the different relationship of beam, freeboard, and draft. At any rate, the whole class was said to have swamped and sunk to the bottom of Buzzards Bay, which put a real damper on further development of the class. I don't think it was quite that bad. When Dad and Uncle Nelson were not racing 15s, they used to sail with the Dabneys, Tom and Fred, on the Bagatelle, and they reminisced about the day they ran back from Cuttyhunk in an unusually fresh sou'wester. Uncle Nelson was sent to the masthead with the end of the anchor rope, which had been rove through one of the large pad eyes on the quarter as a preventer. Then those fearless youths set the spinnaker and surfed all the way back to Wings Neck for the ride of their lives. Claims were made that she only hit the water 3 times after they set her. When Raj Taylor and I were in our teens sailing out of Avondale in the Pawcatuck River, Dad had found his old 15, the Talaris, down somewhere in the Cape, bought her and brought her to Avondale. Raj and I took to her like the proverbial ducks to water and sailed her daily in the river and in Fisher's Island Sound. There was one memorable time when Raj's father had grudgingly agreed to let us go off for a couple of nights, loaded down to half our freeboard with all the gear that I insisted on and Raj tolerated, with the understanding that we were to stay in Fisher's Island Sound. After a night in Hay Harbor, almost in Fisher's Island Sound, during which we surprised a group of local maidens in the midst of a skinny dipping adventure, the screams were said to have been heard in Mystic, we were emboldened to consider that Fisher's Island Sound really meant the Fisher's Island Sound chart. So we sailed home outside the island. Dad was a bit more tolerant of this interpretation than Captain Taylor was. Captain Taylor was my rather stern, retired Navy captain father. Roger's uncle Fred Buffum had bought the Bagatelle and kept her on a mooring off Charlie Cottrell's dock in Avondale. We always used to admire her lines as we sailed down the river, and it was quite natural that Captain Taylor, when it became too much of a burden to haul and launch the Brownie, their Crocker yawl, at Ram Point on the highest tides of the year, decided to seek out a sister of the Bagatelle for the twilight of his sailing years. He found the Aria, traded even for the Brownie, and I might say traded even for the Brownie to the Poindexters, and I hope there's a Poindexter here tonight who can tell me where the Brownie went. Raj and I were seniors at Milton Academy that year, and it was with great dismay that I heard the news that Captain Taylor had passed away without even one season to enjoy the Aria, leaving Raj as head of the family. Rod settled into the traces, launched the Aria with some help from me, and we started racing her in the off-sounding series. We quickly discovered she was to be the terror of Class C, and I think the only time we were ever bested was by some upstart named Ted Turner in his brand new Cal 40. We were actually bested by the Flying Scotsman, which was one of the very earliest hogback, reverse shear, light displacement boats. And she's a very, very ugly boat, and the Aria was a very, very beautiful boat, and man, did we want to beat her. But we just couldn't. It was the 2 days of racing were just like today out here, fresh southwest. And the only time we could creep up on the Flying Scotsman from astern of her was when the breeze eased off a bit. And when it got more moderate, then we began to creep up on her. I think probably in average conditions, those two boats are roughly comparable. But we had mostly fresh to strong headwinds, and we just couldn't hold on to that light displacement fin keeler with the Aria much as we wanted to. But it wasn't actually Ted Turner, it was the Flying Scotsman that beat her. And that was the only race she came in second while we had her. Dave goes on here about some other boats. He's talking here about the Bagatelle. We recognized the time had come to change some things. The engine was lifted out to start a new career as a mooring. The mast became a flagpole, and we started work on the boat. The cabin and deck came off, a new plywood deck went on, and the old cabin and coaming went back. The Bagatelle had the longer house also, but not squared off and up forward. A new longer mast step with strapping to the chain plates was designed and installed. I think that may have been inspired by the Aria's rig, because she had those straps that you guys talked about, and they were put in, I think, when the 6-meter rig was put in before my time with the boat. We took out our back of the envelope sketches of a new yawl rig to Dunham and Timken for them to design it. Genoa #2 jib, main and mizzen staysail were purchased from Manchester and Hayden Aram, Spinnaker, and so forth. During the early 60s, the Bags, a name resurrected by Uncle Nelson from her early years and quickly adopted by her new crew, was a dominant force in many races in Fisher's Island Sound and Buzzards Bay. She won the Beaufort Reeves Trophy every year from 61 to 65 in off-soundings for the boat with the best combined corrected time without additional handicap for the spring and fall series in Class C1. That was the racing class. And so forth about the racing. Mom and Dad had made a habit of observing the races from Sea Turn. That's a Novi fishing boat they had. And after the finish, Dad would crank her up and pick out a nice anchoring spot to serve as the basis for a raft with the Bags, Don Robinson's Volunteer, Lloyd Bergeson's Cockatoo, Jack Hubbard's Hornet, and others, Cockatoo being a New York 30. How fine it was to shoot alongside, put her to bed, and be able to transform ourselves from tension, salt, and sogginess to a freshwater wash, dry clothes, and a beverage or two, and relaxed good fellowship in Sea Turn's capacious cockpit. It was during those years that John Hall and John Hawk were members of our crew on the Bags, and the seeds were sown for them to become her later owners. We made a practice of hauling her in Avondale and keeping her there until off-soundings, and then sailing her for the summer to Hayden Aram, where I was living at the time, and they would come down for a cruise in company with the Sea Turn. He's in the harbor refuge at Point Judith in the Bagatelle with Louis Howland. After a hard day at the office and short sleep the night before, I was bushed, so I prevailed on Louis to take the helm and enjoy the Bags as she slid effortlessly down the beach. This is from Watch Hill to Point Judith, in the moonlight and a light southerly, while I enjoyed some sack time. Imagine my chagrin to awaken to a loud bang and find myself tumbling out into the cockpit with my sleeping bag about my ankles, to find that the fog had rolled in. Louis had been too mindful of my snoring to wake me before we ran up on the Point Judith breakwater. Fortunately, the breeze was still light, and after some groping around, we found the entrance and anchored in the harbor refuge. A check of the bills disclosed she was not making water, and we both turned in. Then they set to work to drive the centerboard back down. It had jammed. They drive the centerboard back down with the shank of our 3-piece Herreshoff anchor for about an hour before it finally dropped free. And so forth. Those years came to an end with Dad's death in March of 1965, and although the Bags and Sea Turn were launched, and we did both spring and fall off soundings, with Ned Watson retiring from the Bags foredeck to serve as Sea Turn skipper, it became evident that with Dad gone and Mum with Alzheimer's, the two-boat scene was more than I could cope with. Raj Taylor was living in Annapolis at the time, came to the rescue with news that Arkady Semenoff could be persuaded to part with his Newport 29, the Mischief, number 728, if the right buyer came along. I therefore began to arrange a multi-boat swap, which ended with John Hawk as the proud new owner of the Bags, Martin Jackson of Concordia buying Sea Turn, and the proceeds going to Arkady for the Mischief. And so ended one era and another began, with which I shall not bore you, even though it once again revolved around a Herreshoff boat and incorporated many of the lessons learned from earlier ones. In recent years, I've been privileged to sail on the Bags again a few times, and on Lloyd Bergeson's 25 replica Torhund on several occasions, and each time the memories come flooding back of that incomparable bow wave and the feeling of effortless gliding motion that seems only to come with the 25s. That's Dave Cabot.
I'd like to now introduce Mrs. Doolittle. Never had the pleasure of meeting you before. Thank you very much for coming.
My father, Bob Parsons, found the Aria in a boatyard in Stamford, Connecticut, the winter of 1944. She was for sale, and he fell in love with her. George Hubbard made one stipulation in the bill of sale. The name Aria had to be changed. However, my father believed in changing the name of a boat no more than changing the name of a person. He solved this with Yankee ingenuity, and we called her the ex-Aria. All the years we owned her, she sailed with this across the Atlantic. My father decided that he and I would sail her around in the Narragansett Bay over the course of 2 or 3 weekends, depending upon the weather, of course. That summer I was 15 years old. It started from the Stamford Yacht Club following a luncheon we never forgot. It was a broiling hot June day with very little air stirring. We went ashore to the yacht club, found the dining room, and started to go in, and the steward accosted my father, insisted that he wear a tie and jacket that the club would provide. It was a very hot luncheon. My father was miserable, and he never forgot it. Not like that these days. Once aboard Aria, everything was great. She had the 6-meter rig then. She sailed beautifully and handled beautifully. With a single burner alcohol stove for our morning coffee and a pail, we were off. Unfortunately, I do not recall each of the stops we made, but I remember going into Sachem's Head, which is such a pretty little harbor, and we left her there one intervening week. And I remember well sailing along the Rhode Island shoreline in a strong northeaster, and Aria worked her way to weather so beautifully that we had to be very careful to keep her off the shore. We owned Aria for 4 seasons, 1944 to 47, and we sailed her a lot. I raced her in the East Greenwich Yacht Club Wednesday evening races, and we sailed her in some of the weekend regattas. She rated in the BC handicap class, and our chief competition was Tyche, a universal rule R-class boat owned by Charlie Dickerson. Invariably, we'd finish first, but when the time allowances were figured, we might be down a couple of notches. In 1945, Bagatelle came into Narragansett Bay, owned by Ike Merriman. We raced against her, and we had a good time. Bagatelle and Aria rated differently, however, because Bagatelle had a head, an engine, and a larger cabin. I sailed Aria alone frequently. She handled so beautifully, and with the sails properly set, She'd sail herself, and I could stow gear or mop the forward deck while underway. I never sailed a boat that handled so well, nor had so much feeling in the tiller. She talked to you when you were at her helm, and I felt as if I could have sailed on forever and anywhere with her. The helmsman was one with the boat. We sold Aria in the fall of 1947 to someone in the westerly area. The Star class was coming back into the bay, and I began racing Stars, where the racing was more competitive. But we never forgot Aria, and we reminisce about her frequently. And I have a beautiful half model of her made by Don Rosenkrantz from Essex, Connecticut. He is a model maker with a national reputation. So this is what I live with today.
I'd like to introduce John Hall, the current owner of Bagatelle.
Very fortunate. My parents have owned a boatyard for years, and which now I'm the proud owner of, and we've been able to take care of Bagatelle for 30 years through a number of owners, through sort of knowing the Buffalo, but certainly starting with the Cabots. Bagatelle was one of the boats that we had to paint twice a year, just a week before spring off soundings, and a sneak out quick before anybody could see, and you painted her again before the fall off soundings, because you had to have the best bottom on that boat. From Dave Cabot owning it, it went to John Hawk, and I was part of that crew that sailed her in the 60s, and with the 40% handicap, we still came in first, and many's the time I can remember on one of the off soundings, it was the start off of 3 Mile, and we zipped up the coast there towards Greenport, and the first 3 boats there at that mark that particular morning, it was a very light day, was Cockatoo, and I think Dolphin and Bagatelle. Regardless of what class we all had started in, there the 3 of us were sitting at the buoy, laughing at everything fiberglass behind us. It was a fun day. John Hawk bought the boat afterwards and still was able to do some maintenance and work and painting, although he took it down to Greenwich, Connecticut for part of the summer. Bagatelle was again an important part of my life. He sold it then to the Parker boys, which lived right across the river from the boatyard, and again I had to go over and help haul the boat out every year for them. Being 2 brothers, they would always argue about whether the boat was too far ahead on the cradle or too far behind. I was the one that said it looked just about right, so let's haul it. So it took a great number of years. We were very fortunate to go up here about 4 years ago to the rendezvous with Bagatelle. It was the first time actually from Westerly, a long trip, to come to Narragansett Bay, but I finally got here in the bags. We came in second that day. Must say Bagatelle is alive and well, and I'll pass some pictures out. We heard some talk about the bow cutting through water. Sure does. Pass these down through. A quiet thing to sail when you're all alone. Sunset's coming. Absolutely is. Another older picture. That was coming back from an off soundings, and I have one from off Watch Hill on a foggy day. And the Watch Hill Yacht Club Block Island Sound Race, watch the edge, it's glass on that one. But coming home from off soundings, reef down, punching our way through it. As a boat 80 years old almost, still going strong. I think some of the finest memories I have, when Dave Cabot's father owned Bagatelle, he's coming into the dock one time, and it fell a shallow slip, sailing alone, everyone's running down under full sail. Ed would lower the main down, lower the jib down, sliding in. The boat came to a perfect stop just before the dock, and everyone said, how did he do that? Well, he had a centerboard, and he was a clever old devil. He had more centerboard than there was water, and he slid that boat right into the dock, dropped the board, and stopped and got off. Really an amazing fine times. One of the other fine times we had, we talk about the spinnaker or with it blowing, is on one of the off soundings, we had set to shoot, and Bagatelle lifted almost totally out of the water, and when he said hit the waves 3 times, and it's pretty close to what would really happen, and 7 of us looked back at Dave and said, take it down. It's too much. The other fun thing, it was kind of, we were up here to the rendezvous, my son who was with me, he said, what sails are we going to use? I said, we're going to use those Van Zandt sails instead of the Manchesters. I said, the new ones. He said, the new ones? They're older than I am. I said, I know, but they're the new ones. But I had many, many wonderful trips in Bagatelle. We're still having many wonderful trips in Bagatelle. She's going to be here this summer. We're still going strong. And Paul, I know why you were sort of you always were afraid to race me, weren't you, you son of a bitch? Well, you're going to beat me in here, but when you get the sails back on, we'll take you on. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce John Hawk.
Well, I don't have very much to say, it's all been said, but one thing I always noticed about Bag in the yawl rig was she was pretty tender in a blow, and we had a rule on the boat that you never sheeted the main to a cleat. You always ran the sheet. And on off soundings one day from 3 Mile to the MOA buoy off of the entrance to Greenport, we got into a little blow and it popped pretty much. And, Jesus, somebody had cleated down the main sheet. And she filled up. Well, she didn't quite. She came this far from the top of the centerboard box. That's how much water was in it. Well, I got every pan and bucket on the boat. We bailed her out. Kept her sailing off a little bit. Bailed her out. My God, we went on and won the race. But you can't do it, but it was awful wet, I'll tell you. That's about all I have to say.
And I'd like to ask Jim Giblin to come up and say a few more words.
I was pleased to read Fred's letter. I put together some of my thoughts, and I'll try and relay them. But, I guess I'm like every other owner here. I don't think any of us haven't looked back and said, why did I sell this boat? I know my son, who worked in the restoration of it, will absolutely never forgive me for selling it. He was only a youngster when we did sell it, but those things happen and things change. Everybody who owns one of these boats certainly considers himself blessed with good fortune. I was, as I said, particularly fortunate because as a result of the work Fred did, Aria was in very sound condition when I acquired her. She had, as I said, a new suit of sails. She didn't really leak. She leaked some when she was pressed hard, but not even enough to worry about unless you were racing and really trying to keep every ounce out of her. It just wasn't a concern. There was a 50-year-old boat, and I was lucky enough really not to have to worry about keeping it together. And the other thing that I consider myself fortunate, the Taylors had refitted the original light and simple high-peak gaff rig. And it was my first experience with a gaff rig. I had never sailed a gaff rig boat before. And so she was up in, I bought her in the winter, and she was up in Mattapoisett. Fred said, I'll get her ready for the water, and you just come up and sail her home. That's not the way to do deliveries. But we got there. So that winter, I went to some used old bookstores, and the best texts I found were H.A. Callahan's Learning to Sail, and written from, what, in the 20s or in the teens. And that really was based on a New York 30. Most of the illustrations and the pictures were a New York 30 gaff rig. And that really told me, how to trim a rig, a gaff rig, and what to look for and what not to do. And from there on, it was pretty easy. But great boats are great teachers, and I think that is one of the things that probably got me through that boat. You read the basics, and then that boat was smart enough to teach you what to do or not to do. I think I'd like to share some opinions on rigs that I've seen in these boats. I was lucky enough to, and these are opinions, and I'm not stating them as facts. Sailors have lots of opinions, and not all of them turn out to be fact. But I knew Mink in the 1950s when she was in Milford, Connecticut, owned by a fellow named Ray Welch. She had a fairly tall jib-headed rig. I don't know what its origin was. Was it a 6? It was a heavy spar, and a lot of wire went with it. And she had an engine beside, and she set down quite a way on her lines. And I never sailed the boat. I knew Ray, but I never sailed in the boat. I did sail against her a couple of times in a handicap class, and it's my impression that she lay over a bit further than most boats. Of course, she was centerboard, but in most comparable boats in an equivalent breeze. And she dragged the transom rather badly. I felt she had to be reefed before she could really develop the power to be competitive in a strong breeze. And that and you can really ruin one of these boats by putting an engine in it. I guess that was my final conclusion. I don't think the rig was, it was heavy, but that engine, I think, really did it in. And I was only a high school kid then, and I wasn't real impressed. Then I was fortunate enough, as I say, to acquire the Aria. And then for several years, 2 years prior to that, I was well acquainted with Bagatelle, having sailed in Fisher's Island Sound and off soundings areas where, as John and everyone has said, that Roger, the boat was notorious. That masthead yawl rig that the Cabots put in, by all accounts, is just an outstanding rig for the boat. I was lucky enough to sail Bagatelle once, home from off soundings, and that's a story for another time. It cost John a lot of money. I blew a brand new chute right out of the tapes, and he never said a word. He never said a word. I hope he doesn't tonight.
He's always been so quiet, too.
Yeah, I know. But Bagatelle, that was a fine rig, but Bagatelle was so well sailed that it was just plain not unusual for that boat to win her class in off soundings with 20 and 25% additional handicap because of her previous victories. I mean, that's the boat. I said I was grateful to have the gaff rig because it was a new experience for me, and to be able to sail a light racing gaff rig is not something that you get a chance to do very much. The gaff rigs on schooners and friendship sloops, they're heavy rigs. They were made for a different purpose. To sail a light, high-peak gaff rig that was built for racing is really something that I treasure very much. But there are some handicaps to that. Racing in light air in Fisher's Island Sound and Long Island Sound, there were many frustrating occasions when I really took gas from more lofty R boats, and in particular Eddie Maxwell's Atlantic. And another observation on rigs, there was an S boat in our handicap class, sailed by Mark Turner, who knew the Sound pretty well. And in light airs, when you get a bobble from a power boat or any leftover slop, that gaff would start flopping around, and you would lose any sail shape you had for minutes on end to recover from that. And the S boat with that fairly high and particularly curved spar, because you were looking at it creeping up on you, and you had lots of time to analyze it. And that curved spar will hold the sail shape in a very light breeze and in a bobble when everybody else is, whether it's the Atlantic or an our boat, is still going to hell, and you just watch them kind of creep away in a drifting condition. When you got some breeze and really could build the power, right, clean as clock. But Fisher's Island Sound and Long Island Sound, that doesn't happen too often. Those are fine people to sail against, and the boat certainly did very well. But I'll tell you, in 12 to 15 knots and better, the power that gaff rig could develop and still keep the boat at her feet, and that was the real part about it. The boat would still be on her feet. It was just a joy to behold. It didn't make any difference whether it was upwind or offwind. The rig could give you a real workout. As everybody said, or John has said, and others know, you've got to play that main sheet. You can't sit there and cleat that thing. If you're sailing that boat and there's a breeze, you better have a hold of it. And with one hand on the main sheet and the other hand on the tiller, you run out of hands and you run out of arm strength pretty quick. I don't know that I could do it today, to be honest with you. I was in my 20s, maybe my early 30s, and I don't think I could do it by myself today. I think you'd have to have somebody else. But there were a couple of times that I had come in from sailing in a real fine day when you just don't want to, you don't want to quit. And by the time I got to my mooring in West Cove, I was so tired. You don't realize it when you're doing it. I was so tired that I'd look at that mainsail and say, I gotta furl that thing. And I'd just lay down on the bench and rest until I could work up the courage and the strength to do it. And usually that was driven by hunger, to tell you the truth. You had to do something. But I'll tell you, you just enjoyed sailing the boat so much you sometimes didn't realize how tired you were. Furling the mainsail was not fun. The most recent rig development for this class is Lloyd Ferguson's Tor Hun. It's a large fractional sloop rig. It's light, it's simple, it's clean, and it's really quite powerful. It's very well balanced. I sailed in the boat once. You don't get to take the helm too much with Lloyd, but I got my hands on it once for a few minutes. For those, this is kind of an inside joke, and I was really hoping Lloyd would be here.
He's here. Be careful.
He is. Good. Hello. It does, however, need to be shortened down earlier than a New York 30. And I'm glad you're here. I don't have too many one-liners, Lloyd. In summary, I take any of them again. But if I had one of the 25s and was day sailing in Buzzards Bay or Narragansett Bay, I'd want the gaff sloop rig. If I was day sailing in Fisher's Island and Long Island Sounds, I'd want Lloyd's Tor Hun. And if I was cruising in various waters, I'd prefer the Cabot's masthead yawl rig. Now, that kind of covers the basics. So there you have it. As that fellow Ferguson said a couple of weeks ago when he was here, you have to start with a good hull. And these were great hulls.
Thank you very much, Jim. Roger.
Reading Dave Cabot's experience about the running into the Point Judith breakwater reminds me of one I had in the Aria. When I inherited the boat, I was a whippersnapper of 17. I knew absolutely everything that anyone could know about boats at that age. You couldn't tell me a thing. So off I went one day by myself in the Aria. She has the 6-meter rig, and it breezed up southwest like today, only harder. And I was heading up the beach from Watch Hill to Point Judith, heading for Buzzards Bay. And I knew that I should go in behind the breakwater at Point Judith because it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon and it was really breezing out. And it was going to be dark before I could get to Padenham or anywhere down there. So I knew I should go in behind the breakwater, but I didn't realize how tired I was. I was having so much fun sailing the boat that I just somehow went by outside the breakwater. And then I thought, oh, this is really crazy. I've got to get inside that breakwater, which meant jibing and going in the east entrance to the Harbor of Refuge instead of the west one. The west one would have been very easy. Just reach in, round up, drop the anchor. Now I got to jibe, and I'm in a mess of a chop in the entrance to the breakwater, wondering how am I going to get the jib down before I get in there. So I let the main sheet go, let go of the tiller, and went forward to take the jib down. And this is a boat that teaches you. When I looked around frantically, thinking we'd be charging off at one side of the breakwater or the other, both close by, she was doing neither. She was just sitting there, waiting for me to come back and trim the sheet and take the tiller again. So this is definitely a boat that can teach you things. Racing, I want to talk a little bit about racing and a little bit about rigs, because Jim raised some really interesting stuff about the different rigs that have been in these boats. And I had the experience of sailing the boat with the 6-meter rig and then with the gaff rig, the original gaff rig that I had put back in, so I could sort of tell how she compared with those two rigs. And you're absolutely right. The only time that the boat suffered with the gaff rig compared to the 6-meter rig was in very light air, when she missed that really tall triangle of sail way up high where there's usually a little more breeze. In very light air, she definitely suffered with the gaff rig because of the low aspect ratio. But other than that, she didn't suffer at all with the gaff rig. She sailed very, very comparably, I thought. And I didn't actually experience any sense of being overpowered with the tall rig in terms of stability or tenderness. She never scared me with the tall rig in terms of heeling over too much. And I didn't feel I had to reefer any sooner with the 6-meter rig than with the gaff rig. You might wonder, well, how did she go to windward with the two rigs? And the answer is very, very comparably the same. This was not a boat that you sail really close to the wind anyway, I think because of the fairly beamy, shallow hull shape. You know, sailing close to the wind isn't just a matter of what's going on with the rig, but it's also what shape hull do you have. And that was not a boat that liked to be pushed up into the eye of the wind. She would go to windward fast in the off-soundings races against eastern interclubs, for instance, with a tall, narrow rig and narrow, deep hulls. They would outpoint us. They'd be going way up to windward, but we'd be footing so much faster that we had no trouble beating them to the windward mark. But that was about the same with the 6-meter rig and with the gaff rig. To get her to go to windward at her best, you had to head off and concentrate on footing rather than concentrate on pointing up into the wind. So the hull shape, I believe, couldn't really take full advantage of the weatherliness of the 6-meter rig. Anyway, it seemed to me, from my experience of sailing with both rigs, that she went very, very incomparably with both rigs, except in a very light air when she missed that topsail way up there with the tall rig. The gaff rig, I guess well, it's all on the sail plan, but the peak of the mainsail is probably 36, 37 feet high, and the peak of that 6-meter rig is more like 45 feet above the water. So it's quite a difference there. We had one great race around Fisher's Island when we beat the Bolero, the Sparkman and Stevens 72-foot yawl, boat for boat. We had to cheat to do it, but we did it. It was a very light northwest day, and going across the backside of Fisher's Island on the outside, under a weather shore, the northwester, the little puffs would come down off the land right close to shore, but by the time you got out 100 yards, it was nothing. Well, the Bolero had to stay out 100 yards so she wouldn't hit the rocks. We had the centerboard, we could bounce along, you know. If we hit a rock, we'd just pull up the board. So we snuck in and kept going when they had to stop out there in the calm. So we managed to beat her. The most interesting race I ever had in the Aria was against the Bagatelle in the same race around Fisher's Island Sound, around Fisher's Island. I had sold the Aria. I don't know if you were racing her that day, Paul.
Yeah.
Jim, you were racing, okay. You and somebody else. There were two of you aboard.
Neighbor.
And you guys didn't do a darn thing all day but sit there and steer and maybe trim a jib sheet now and then.
I tell.
No, I was watching you. I was watching you. You tacked a few times, but I mean, that was a big excitement for you. And I can tell with the yawl rig, Dave Hager had us putting mizzen staysels up and down, spinnaker staysel, trim this, jibe that. Oh, we worked our tails off, and we beat you by about a minute boat for boat, and you saved your timeouts. So I think the gaff rig is great.
That was a hard easterly day. Well, not hard, but 15 to 20 on the backside of the island. There was lots of power that day. Yeah.
Well, I was envious. I was working my tail off, and I'd see you over there sitting.
I was hoping you'd drag your feet. Not the David's boat.
Well, I think it's absolutely great that this boat is here, and absolutely great that she's been all fixed up to her original shape, and it's just a wonderful thing that Paul has done and Halsey is doing with all this stuff. It's a big thrill to me to come here and to see this boat in this place and to see all this interest in it.
Does anyone have any questions, comments?
I'd like to ask a question. There was a, can you remember who it was? It was giving us a little bit of the boat specifications and said there was 3,000 pounds of outside lead ballast. Is that correct?
That statement was taken from the Beverly Yacht Club yearbook. Just about every publication has a different figure, and I'll be glad to give you half a dozen different ones, and hopefully somebody will calculate it.
Approximately that.
Really? I'm surprised it's that little.
3,300 pounds.
3,300.
And what was the displacement supposed to be?
Lloyd?
7,000 pounds. With no people in the water.
Yes, sir.
They were awful like those.
I'd be interested in who put the 6-meter rig in Aria, and also perhaps some of the others had 6-meter rigs. Maybe Nancy knows what her father did. It was before you owned her.
Before we owned her, she came to us with the 6-meter rig.
There's an account of the Block Island race in 1941 in yachting, and she had a 6-meter rig in her at that time. A gentleman by the name of Hubbard owned her down the other end of Long Island Sound. And I'm not sure if he put it in or if it went before that.
I think most of you know that that gaff rig mast that's in her is a hollow mast that built like a fly rod. And I don't know, I never weighed it, but it was one time, I'm not real big, but somewhere around the age of 28, I had to move it, varnish it or something, and I could pick the damn thing up and walk with it. I mean, I couldn't go very far with it, but I could get both arms underneath and walk with it. So it's a real magnificent piece of work. You think of gaff rig masts, often in boats that size are smaller, solid sticks, but this thing is really exquisite. It's got a couple of repairs to it, but it caused me bends a bit.
Any other comments? Yes, sir.
What's your next boat gonna be like? Well,
Oh, we'll have to wait and see.
wait and see, yeah.
Like I say, the only reason I got rid of Bagatelle was because I got transferred to Atlanta, Georgia. Michelle Olcott. And that was the end of Bagatelle. I couldn't take her down there. So I got rid of her.
Anyone else? No, I just have a couple closing remarks. I think obviously every owner is important to the ongoing life of a boat, but with Aria in particular, I think there are 3 periods in her life that stand out as the most important. Certainly, Nathaniel Herreshoff, the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company, the people that built her, and and the family that originally owned her and took her to Marion caused it all to begin. And as Jim Giblin so well pointed out, Fred Farnham giving her second lease on life with Alan Beitze as a mentor in Mattapoisett certainly got her through very well. And her third opportunity in life is with the Herreshoff Maritime Museum. And I'd like to thank the administrators of the museum, all the membership of the museum, and all the people that have worked on her to get her to this point. It's a great joy to me. Thank you all very much for coming this evening.
Well, Paul, it's hard for us to express our appreciation to you, and she's going to be here to admire from here on, and we hope you and all the people who've had a role in her will come and admire her frequently. I'd like to also, even though the hour is a little late, ask Lloyd if he doesn't have one or two extra comments about his building Tor Hun from the same lines. Lloyd, you've come down from a long ways. Do you have a couple of words for us? You've never lost the words, are you?
Here, or wherever you want. Number one, the 6 inches of freeboard, I believe I would have driven Aria under many, many times coming from New York 30 to a boat like that. Tor Hun, I can't drive under. She has a lot more initial stability. And I enjoy that. And that gives me a little chance to cruise with her. I think she's just as fast in light air and faster than the gaff rig. I think everybody that has commented on that is correct. But I think if I were going to do it over again, believe it or not, I'd put a gaff rig in her. Maybe I'd have both of them. Change them.
Oh, God.
How I felt. Say that again?
I said, Lloyd, you probably make us change rigs during the race.
Possibly, but I think that it would be very enjoyable to sail that hull with a gaff rig. And I personally think that gaff rigs are very underrated because they get more area up higher. And did you ever think, why doesn't somebody try this? Put a topsail on one of these gaff 25s, and I think you'd beat the pants off me, for example, in Tor Hun. That's anyway. They're wonderful boats, and apparently you can't spoil them because the things I did didn't seem to spoil her as far as racing. So I'm very glad I built to that model.
Well, thank you very much, Lloyd. And just a couple of quick notes. Alan Beitze, by the way, was here just a few days ago and was aboard the Aria, and he was very admiring of the work that was done, and it's sort of nice to see all the people who have been involved to come back and see the boat. And Lloyd, you have another word.
I have one thing. She seems to win under whatever rule that you want to race her under, which is true of every Herreshoff boat I've ever had anything to do with.
Well, I think I'd just like to mention, too, that some of you may be interested. We're going to try out and see how we do with one of the museum's boats this weekend that Andy's helped us with very much by getting into good condition, and Lloyd's helped us a lot by rescuing some sails from the middle of the ocean that he's donated to us. And I'm referring to the yacht Bambino, which has been commissioned now after 12 years of layup here. And we sailed her last weekend to Hyannis, and we're going to race her in the Fagawi race from Hyannis to Nantucket on Saturday, and again back on Monday from Nantucket to Hyannis. And the museum, through the generosity of our friend Michael Dealey, has donated a very handsome trophy to the Fagawi organization, which is very kindly featuring the Bambino in the race. Michael Dealey is a great friend of ours who does a number of things to help out, and I'm grateful to him for donating the trophy, and I'm especially grateful to him for persuading the committee there to give us a rating that seems suitable for a yacht 89 years old, and we hope that that rating will help us a little bit this weekend. We'll let you know how that goes out. Now, just before we close, I'd like to ask Mike if he would please come forward once more. And, you know, Mike Buzzards is the architect of these sessions, for which I'm grateful, and I know all of you are. And I'd like just to ask Mike if he would tell us about the next one.
Thank you, Halsey. I assume everyone here has gotten the schedule. We have 5 more very wonderful lectures scheduled. The next one I'm particularly excited about. It's the Maxwell brothers, who many of you I know and have sailed with, have sailed against. I'm very interested to learn more about their family's ownership of Herreshoff boats. From what I understand and from what I've read, it's a very long and proud tradition of Maxwell family owning Herreshoff boats, including the beautiful schooner Queen, the turn of the century. So they will be here, Eddie and Cooch Maxwell, on June 29th. Couple other notes, if you need one of these, there are a bunch of them on the table as you leave. Also, admission to the lectures is a modest $3 for members and $5 for non-members. So if you'd like to take advantage of the lower rate, I encourage everyone, if you're not a member, to become a member. And thanks everyone for coming tonight. This was a wonderful lecture, really enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and don't forget the refreshments in the next room. Come back in June. Nice to have you here. Thank you very much.